So good morning. Pascal Chariot speaking. I'm the CEO of Enerdata, and I'm happy to welcome you to this webinar. So good morning for Europe or for the US. Good afternoon for Asian participants. We might have around 200 participants today. So technically speaking, the webinar will start now. You're muted, the participants are muted because we cannot hold getting the questions by voice with so many people. But you're welcome to ask questions or put comments through the chat box which you have on your screen, and it should work. So either we'll be able to catch and answer your questions during the webinar itself, or we'll take them and come back to you later with the answers, depending on the length and duration of the webinar. So let's start. I'm here with Morgan Krenes, with the new head of our market research team, and with Séverine, which will manage all the questions and answer. So this is a regular appointment we have every year in our organization, gathering all the data of the previous year and putting together the key messages. So as every year, end of May, we publish these analysis based on the G20 countries. So we'll talk about, as every year, about economic growth, about what are the trends of the energy markets, and what are the trends of the emissions. We'll go by countries, looking at the key countries, and we'll go also by energy. So before starting on the content, I'd like to remind you what were the 2016 conclusions last year. So this is what the key messages that we had last year on this slide. I will not repeat everything, but basically last year we had a third year in a row with a correct, let's say, economic growth, but mostly with a stable or almost stable energy demand at a global level, and with almost stable energy-related CO2 emissions. So we had 3 years like this, which were coming both from limited growth, economic growth in OECD countries, and with an overall reduction of energy demand or decorrelation between demand and emissions and economic growth in the non-OECD countries, namely in China. As in China, during the last 2 or 3 years, we had a big, still a regular economic growth, but a big decrease, a big improvement of energy intensity, which had an impact on the overall world CO2 emissions. So these were the key messages for last year, in line with the previous years. And the question is, what about 2017? That's what we will go through now. So the first part, we'll look at the key figures at a global level, and then we'll go in the second part to the key figures per market: coal, oil, renewables, etc. And in the third part, we will make a focus on some specific countries. So the key figures for 2017 are the ones on the screen right now. So before starting on the different graphs, what we're used to do is to show, like here, the 3.7% is the figure of 2017 compared with 2016. Then at the bottom, you have 2016 compared with 2015, and then you have 2005 to 2015, the average of the 10 previous years. And this is the way we will show all the different indicators among the following slides. Another remark as an introduction is that we are basing this analysis on the G20 figures. So the G20 are the 20 key biggest countries in the world, 19 countries plus the European Union. And it accounts globally for more than 80% of the global energy consumption. The second more technical definition before starting is that when we talk here about CO2 emissions, we are talking about CO2 energy related emissions from energy combustion, which is not all the CO2 emissions. does not cover everything, but it's more also than 80%. So the trends that we are showing here are very significant at the world level. And in some specific cases, we will explain the difference that could exist between the G20 only and the world figures, for instance. So the key figures for 2017 are these ones. Economic growth, 3.7%. Energy consumption, plus 2.1%. And CO2 emissions grew by 2% last year. So we'll go in details through this. Sorry. The first slide is about the economic growth. So here, to read these graphs, again, some technical introduction. So for every graph, we have on the right, dark blue, the 2017 figure. Lighter one is the 2016 figure. And usually we have just a line with the average of 2005 to 2015. Only for this graph about GDP growth, we split it into before crisis, so 2000 to 2008, and after crisis, 2009 to 2015. So that's why we have this figure. Then we have the key countries here. So you have the G20 always on the left, the non-OECD total. Then you have some of the non-OECD countries, and we have the OECD figure, and then some of the OECD countries or regions. And at the bottom of the slide, you have the weight of the given countries or regions among the G20. So, for instance, in terms of economy, GDP, non-OECD represents 47% of the G20. So the rest, 53, is OECD. Japan represents 5% of G20. So that's just how to read the slide, the graphs. So we have last year in 2017, we had quite a good economic growth, stable or slightly improving at the non-OECD level, as you see in the comments there, and increasing quite significantly at the OECD level, especially for the European Union and in the USA. So these are figures that you know that are public, that have been published for already a couple of months. So we won't comment these in detail. It's more what are the consequences on the energy markets and emissions. Then if we look now at the energy consumption, so 3.7% economic growth, 2% energy consumption. So the energy consumption growth doubled compared with 2016, where it was 1%, and it went up to 2%. It grew both at the non-OECD level, going up to 3% growth, and at the OECD level, growing at 1% pace. One of the key changes compared with last year is that China came back to a higher growth in terms of energy consumption compared with the previous years. India remains every year with a stable high level of growth, and Russia also was significantly growing. We'll come back to this. At the OECD level, the key points are to be noted are the stability in the US, to be linked with the quite high economic growth. So the energy demand nevertheless has been quite stable, while in the European Union, with the same kind of economic growth, the energy consumption grew by 1%. So now if we look at the difference between economic growth and energy consumption, we go to what we call the energy intensity. So these graphs show the energy intensity evolution among the years and among the different countries. So the definition of energy intensity is on it's written at the bottom of the box. It's the ratio between energy consumption and gross domestic. So it's how many kilowatt per hour you need to produce €1 of economic value. Basically, among the years, this is linked with the evolution of the structure of the economy. So if you, in a given country, you go to a more or a less energy-intensive economy, like moving from a industry to services or to lighter industry, this has a direct impact on the energy intensity, but also energy intensity shows all the efforts and results achieved through energy efficiency improvement. The average improvement among the years at the world level is between 1.5 and 2 points. So this is what we also saw during the last years. It was even a little higher. There was 2.5, 2%. And this year, the energy intensity reduction decreased. So we have reached to 1.76%. So compared with the historical trend, this is not a very good news in terms of energy consumption, and mostly when we go to the CO2 emissions. A big part of this is linked to China, where China had reached a great progress during the last years, moving its economy to a lighter economy, more to services and so on. And this year, there was not such a big change. It doesn't mean that China increased its energy consumption or energy intensity level, but did not improve it as much as during the previous years. Now, if we go to the last figure, it's about the CO2 emission. The CO2 emissions grew related to energy consumption and combustion. It grew by 2% last year, so the same as energy consumption. So this is a new increase after a couple of years of almost stabilization. So it grew both at the non-OECD level, with quite a strong increase, and at the OECD levels, with different news or different signification. At the non-OECD level, during the last years, you have to split China and out of China. China had a big effort during the last years, and thanks to its energy intensity improvement, and also to the progressively decreasing part of coal in the energy mix, China had managed to stabilize its emissions despite a regular economic growth, which was not the case last year. As you can see here, China grew by 2%, which is much less than the economic growth that they reached with 6%, but it's more than zero. Out of China, at the non-OECD level, the other countries are continuously growing their emissions in line, let's say, almost in line with their economic growth. So the development of India and other areas are quite directly linked. Well, is consuming the same level of energy and getting to the same level of CO2 emissions almost every year. So India is growing. India even, for instance, is increasing its level of CO2 emissions as the coal has a bigger part in the energy mix every year. At the non-OECD level, this is a new, quite a big news, because it's the first growth of emissions that has been seen for the last 10 years. So it's the first time the OECD have grown their emissions, and it's not in the US that it occurred. It's mostly in the European Union with 2%, but also in Japan. So we'll explain this after in details, but the European Union enjoyed some improvement in the economic growth, did not achieve a good result in energy intensity improvement, and did not change its energy mix. So the emissions grew. So 2% of CO2 emission growth. Now, if we take a step back, looking at the evolution for the last years since the beginning of the century, if you have a graph representing the key indicators from 2000 to 2017. So on the left up of the screen, you have the trend of the emissions. So you can see that until 2010 or 11, there was a 2-3% growth of the emissions year after year. Then since 2012, both thanks to reduced economic growth, but also to efforts in energy consumption and on the energy mix, the growth decreased. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean that there was a decrease in the emissions in absolute value. So you see the average and you see the trends. On the right, we just put with the green figure here, we just put what means a 2-degree scenario. If we take a step back at the COP21, the 3% decrease would be the objective that should be reached in CO2 emissions in average between 2015 and 2050 to divide the CO2 emissions by 2 and reach a 2-degree scenario or 2-degree temperature increase by the end of the century. So which is something we have never been able to manage, and what it's in, you can see here is that the trend is not clearly going into that direction. On the right up, you have the trend of the GDP growth, so which is well known, and at the bottom you have the 2 key factors that can explain the evolution of the emissions. So on the right, you have the energy intensity evolution, which is what I commented earlier, that the average good year, bad year is 1.5%. It has quite well improved during the last years. It has been a regular trend in the OECD countries, but it has been a growing trend in the non-OECD countries, and namely in China during the 3 previous years. So this year, as mentioned, we made a step back there. And on the left one, you have what we call the carbon factor evolution, which is the other part explaining the emissions. On the right, you have how many kilowatt hour per unit of GDP per euro. And on the left, you have how many CO2 emissions is producing 1 kilowatt per hour of energy production. So this is what we call the carbon factor. The carbon factor at the world level increased between 2000 and 2010, mostly because of the increasing weight of the non-OECD countries and because of the fossil fuel parts of the non-OECD countries, mostly due to the coal growth in China. That was the impact. Then since 2008-9 on, we didn't have such an increase, and even slight decrease during the last year, but very limited. And that was also some impact of renewable growth in OECD countries and some decrease of coal in China. But you see that we never reached, so the carbon factor evolution is very slow, and we never reached any strong evolution on a year-to-year basis. So what is at stake is if you want to reach a 3% decrease year after year of the CO2 emissions, it means that the sum of the carbon factor reduction and the energy intensity improvement has to be 3%, so which is quite far from what we have today. Then, now if we look with this historical trend, what is required to get back on a Paris COP21 agreement and objective? This is what we have analyzed. In 2005 to 2015, the average was 1.7% increase every year. Then last year, 2016, or the year before, there was almost a stabilization of the emissions. And this year, 2017, we had a 2% increase, which means that the effort that was foreseen between 2015 and 2050 to get a 2 degrees Celsius temperature increase by the end of the century was estimated at 2.9% per year 2 years ago. And now, after 2 years of difference between the objective and the result, the new effort is 3.5%. So which is very interesting to see that after only 2 years of running after the objectives and being delayed, the size of the step is increasing very quickly. So the objective now would be to have an average improvement of 3.5% per year of the emissions, which the last comment we put it that what it means is that the emissions, the additional emissions the world had last year and the year before, 2016, 2017, is, in another word, 1/3 of what would be the emissions in 2050. So this is not a good trend. We, after 3 years, which were encouraging, even if not performing enough. So the conclusion at this stage are the following. On one hand, 2017 differs from the 3 last years. The 3 previous years were, again, quite encouraging, but 2017, there are 2 strong messages, one on the energy intensity and the other one on the energy mix, which are not improving quickly enough. So the energy demand is growing and the CO2 emissions are growing. At the OECD level, this is a key point. So the first CO2 emissions increase in 10 years, and where the European Union has a specific challenge. And at the non-OECD level, basically, there is not a big change if you look at different countries like India, Turkey, etc., which are consuming a lot of and increasing their level of emissions. And it's more the impact of China, which has not been improving as much as the previous years, that is significant there. And the bottom point is that we are taking, well, the delay we are taking in cutting the CO2 emissions compared with the 2050 objectives is increasing. So again, the size and the efforts will be increasing at the same level. So this is the end of the first part. I will give the floor to Morgan to present the second part where we will go through the trends by energy. We'll have a couple of questions. We'll answer them probably at the end about technical questions like the documentation. You will be receiving all the slides right after the webinar today, so there is no question about this.
Okay, thanks very much, Pascal. This is Morgan Krenes speaking, Head of Market Research. So now we'll start part 2, focusing on global trends for each energy. And then we'll have a third part around focusing on some regions and countries. So for the second part, we'll start with a global trends in the market shares for each energy. If we look at G20, you can see that in the past years, from 2000 to 2015, coal overtook oil as a major energy source. So this is what happened in G20. You have to keep in mind that at the world level, oil is still the major source of energy. But in the last years, in 2016, 2017, you can see that the gap between coal and oil tightened, and now we have the stabilization of coal share in the mix, but the gap with oil is tightening. If you look at China, of course, we have a lot of coal, but it's decreasing slowly. In the EU, main source of energy is oil in the primary mix, and gas is slowly increasing. And in the US, oil is a main source of energy as well, and gas in 2017, we'll see it later on, was slightly decreasing. A few words about coal. So it was a special year for coal. After 3 consecutive years of decline, coal consumption increased at the world level. So it was mainly driven by India and Russia, especially in power generation, and in OECD countries, especially in Europe and USA. We can see that we have a substitution from coal to gas. In Japan, the strong economic growth led to an increase in electricity consumption and coal consumption. If we look at coal price now, with a focus on China coal production and imports, we can see that 2017 was a year with a strong increase in coal price, despite removal of production limitation in China. And we had increasing imports, which led to increasing prices. Have to keep in mind that in India, South Korea, overall in Asia, we had a strong demand for coal. At the same time, on the supply side, we had some harsh climatic events affecting production in Indonesia, Australia, and Colombia. Now looking at oil prices, as you may know, oil price increased in 2017 following the decrease in OPEC production by 1%, and for Saudi Arabia it was more around 5%. At the same time, in the US we had an increase in oil production and strong demand driven by petrochemical, but also transportation, road transportation, with increasing sales for cars, but also increasing share of sport utility vehicles in the total new cars sold on the market. In early 2018, prices are still increasing, driven by geopolitical events in Iran, Venezuela. But as you may know, Saudi Arabia and Russia might increase oil production in the near future, which led to a $3 decrease last Friday in oil price. So if we look now at oil consumption, following the strong economic growth, we had an increase in oil consumption, even if it's slightly lower than what we observed in 2016. It's still at a good level, especially in OECD, but also in non-OECD countries. If you look at the graph, we can see that historically we had a decrease in oil consumption due to energy efficiency and switch to other energy. But for the past 3 years, we had an increase in oil consumption in the US, and in EU. So, as I said before, it's mainly driven by global economic growth, petrochemical, and transportation sector. I will go very quickly with natural gas prices, since it follows mainly the oil price trends. But what is very interesting this year, in 2017, is increasing competitiveness of gas relatively to coal in European market, especially, which led to a substitution from coal to gas in Europe in the poor sector. So for gas demand in G20 strongly increasing, substitution from coal to gas, many policies in that direction in China, in Europe, and in the US. It was quite different, with a big decrease in electricity consumption, and at the same time good hydro conditions, and a decrease in gas power generation. And in Europe, it was, on the contrary, an increase in gas power generation due to poor hydro conditions, limited nuclear generation, and electricity consumption growing. Okay, so now let's have a look at electricity. So electricity consumption, it's the same as for the other fuel. We have two separate trends. For non-OECD, big growth led by economic growth, and in non-OECD countries, it's stabilizing due to energy efficiency efforts. In Japan, the economic recovery led to a strong increase in electricity consumption. And overall, due to a switch to an electrification, in final uses, electricity consumption is increasing more than the average of other fuel. Now looking at supply, power supply, if we look at global electricity production, power generation, on graph on the left, we can see that global renewables, including hydro, is ranked second in terms of energy, in terms of fuel for power generation, with coal stabilizing in 2017 in terms of market share, and a very strong non-hydro renewables growth in 2016 at 23%. And if we step back and we look at what we had in the power mix in 2000 compared to 2017, we can see that globally thermal fossil power generation has relatively stable market share. Nuclear is decreasing. It was 18% in 2000. It's only 12% in 2017, and a very strong growth in non-hydro renewables, increasing tenfold, especially wind and solar. Now we'll have a look at specific power generation technology, starting with fossil fire power plants, gas and coal. So we have three graphs here. So the first one, it's a net evolution in power capacities. And in the bottom right corner, we have the new power plants. So in terms of new capacities, we can see that in China, following policy of substitution from coal to gas, we had increasing gas capacities. Not many new stabilizing coal capacities at the same time. In the US, substitution from coal to gas. In Europe, phasing out of coal. And in India, new coal capacities. If we look at the new power plants, it's very clear that in the US, we had many additional gas-fired power plants. And in India, coal power plants. It's driven by the national resources, with abundant resources of gas, shale gas in the US, and coal in India. We have to notice that 2017, for the first time, no new coal power plants in the US. If we look now at the graph on the bottom left corner around the evolution of power generation, so the evolution is mainly driven by the difference between total electricity demand growth and minus a fatal production from nuclear and renewable technologies. So in China, strong growth in electricity demand with a mix dominated by coal. So coal-fired power plants had an increase in load duration from 4,100 hours per year to 4,000 to 250 hours per year, so plus 4%. So it led the increase in power generation coal. In the US, you can see that we are decreasing gas power generation due to a very good year for hydro. And in Europe, on the contrary, poor hydro conditions and limited nuclear generation, which led to an increase in gas power generation. Now, if we look at wind power generation, and next slide it will be solar, you can see that it was a very good year for renewable. Wind plus solar are responsible of 50% of additional power generation in G20 in 2017. China accounts for 30% of G20 wind power generation. We can see that there is a very strong dynamic in China, but also in other countries, globally in Europe, in the US. And we have to keep in mind that we have very strong objective for wind in China and in India. So even if in absolute, the market share is not very strong now in this country, in a close future, we could expect major changes in the power mix. Regarding solar, increase is spectacular in China. If you look at the red line, red trajectory, the increase is very strong. It's the same in the US and other countries. In Europe, it's still increasing, but at a lower pace compared to other regions. So solar new power generation in 2017 was responsible for 20% of the new power generation. In China, it increased by 75%, the new power generation from solar. So a very good year for solar overall. So now key messages for energy consumption in G20 in 2017. So for all energy, we had a strong increase, especially for electricity with electrification of final uses, and a special year for coal, increasing coal demand following 3 years of decline. 2017, in terms of prices for fossil fuel, was also a special year with increasing prices, reversal of trends, and a strong increase in coal prices. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, a very strong momentum for renewable energy, especially in power generation, with a plus 23% of power generation, and overall responsible for more than 50% of additional power generation in G20 level. So that's it for part 2. So the last part of this presentation is a country focus, looking at what happened in terms of consumptions, emissions in several regions and countries. So I will not go through all the slides we'll send you later on. I will just focus on China, US, and Europe. So here you have focus on China. We have 4 graphs in the slide. It's always the same graphs. And we are looking at evolution of CO2 emissions, energy-related CO2 emissions. So this is the top left graph. Then energy intensity and mix, primary mix at the bottom left, and power mix on the right. So you can see that we have 2 orange bars on the first 2 graphs. So those are projection from Enerdata, which is an Enerdata scenarios from Future. So you can have a look at those scenarios, those projections on our website. And those scenarios are in line with 3-4 degrees increase of temperature in the long term. More or less, it's in line with the NDC objectives and all the national objectives in 2030. So it gives a good idea of where we should go if we want to achieve the NDC objectives and limit temperature increase by 3 or 4 degrees. So if we start with China, we can see that historically we had very big growth in energy-related CO2 emissions from 2005 to 2015. In 2016, emissions stabilized, but in 2017, it increased, driven by economic growth, and it's above the average increase we should have to be in line with NDC objective. Regarding energy intensity, which is a ratio of energy consumption by unit of GDP, we can see that it's decreasing, strongly decreasing, minus 3.7% in 2017, and it's in line more or less with NDC objectives for 2030. Looking at energy mix trend now, we can see that in power generation, at least, we have a very strong increase of renewables in the market share, a slow decrease in 2017 of coal market share, and overall, so decarbonated energy is increasing in the mix, but maybe not at a sufficient pace. In the US now, despite all Trump announcements, we can see that emissions stabilized in 2017, even if we have a strong economic growth. And looking at energy intensity, we can see that it's in line with the objectives. Energy intensity is decreasing at -2% in 2017, and it was especially the case in poor sector. So in electricity consumption. As I mentioned earlier, we had a strong decrease of electricity consumption in 2017. Now, looking at the mix, we have an increase of decarbonated energy in the power mix with a strong renewable growth, good hydro year in 2017, and overall in 2017. No big changes in the primary mix, decrease in gas consumption. So the decrease in the gas market share for primary mix. Now in the European Union, it's quite different. We are not in a very good dynamics in Europe. In the past years, 2005, 2015, emissions were decreasing at around -3% per year, which is in line with the objectives of -1.8%. But in 2016, it stabilized, and in 2017, it increased by 2%, which is not on the right dynamics. So regarding now energy intensity, it's still decreasing, -1.6%, but not in line with the objective. So we can see that energy mix is not changing a lot. We have coal phase out, so it's decreasing. Coal market share is decreasing in primary mix, but no big change in primary electricity and biomass market share. It's not increasing a lot. However, in the power mix, we can see that we had a good increase in non-hydro renewables, but it's only partially offsets the decrease of hydro power generation and nuclear power generation. We can see that there is some substitution from coal to gas as well. So in the presentation we'll send you, you will have additional focus for 3 European countries, France and Germany, which are quite in line with the European trends, But for UK, you can see that UK it's much more positive. If you compare the global trends for CO2 emissions and energy intensity, it's quite in line and even above what we should have to achieve the objectives. So that's it for the presentation, and now we'll start answering your question. So we'll have a look at these questions in the next 15 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you, Morgan. So we are reading at the same time the questions you ask. So please take 1 minute to put some of the questions, and we'll select some, and we have 5 to 10 minutes max before closing. So please go ahead. There is one or two definition, or a couple of questions. So one is about technical one, splitting CO2 emissions from fossil fuels or from other fuels from, well, globally. So we are here talking about CO2 emissions related to energy consumption, which means these are the emissions coming from fossil fuels, basically. And you know that coal is emitting more, but there are differences in coals and in the power plants for coal, but it is emitting more than oil, and oil is emitting more than gas, than natural gas. So we are talking about fossil fuel emissions here. There is a couple of questions where we answer directly because they are quite technical or focused, and probably would not be of interest for everyone. I need to move back to the screen now. There is one question here about, I've not been very clear, I think, about the trends and the efforts we need to do. So sorry for this. I will make it clearer. Here, when we say we need to achieve a -3% trend in the CO2 emissions, it does not mean that the sum of the carbon factor evolution and energy intensity needs to be 3%, because we have also at the same time a trend in the economy. So if we take an assumption that the world economy will grow by 3% every year, for instance, which is the current trend and which is the IMF forecast so far. So if we take a 3% trend in the GDP growth, and if we want to achieve a 3% decrease in CO2 emissions, then we need to get a 6% improvement per year in energy intensity and carbon factor. So to get the 3%, again, I repeat, in 3% decrease to achieve the Paris objective, if we take a 3% growth as an assumption at the economic level, we need to have an improvement of 6 points of the decarbonization and energy intensity, which can be 4% per year of energy intensity improvement plus 2% of carbon factor, or vice versa. But we are talking about this. If the economic growth is higher, it means the effort, the improvement needs to be higher, and if the economic growth goes down, the effort has to go down. So sorry for the confusion if there was any, but this is what we're talking about. There was one question about, is China in coal? Is China behaving as a monopoly for coal, as they have 50%, they represent 50% of the market? So it's, I think, a bit more complex than this. China has even been importing, so China is not, there would be a kind of monopoly or strong impact on the market if a country was to produce 80% of the world resources with consuming only 10%, so having a very strong impact. Like the OPEC has sometimes on oil, etc., a very strong impact. So, but China basically is, let's say, almost balanced, or even importing on a regular basis coal. So China is not so far just behaving as a monopoly situation. They are looking for resources elsewhere, and at the same time they are improving their industry in the coal and trying to decrease its part. So it's a bit more complex, and you have some more. Plus, coal is very local also. So South Africa, Australia have strong markets and exporting a lot. Yeah, and China represents, we are looking at our database at the same time. China represents about 20% of the world coal and lignite imports year after year. So, yeah, there are some precise ones that will go back directly to the people. Someone is asking about the focus on Germany. So we didn't go through all the countries, what Morgan showed, but so if we look at Germany, yeah, so Germany. So basically Germany has some strong points and weak points in terms of results if you compare with the objectives that are announced. So the strong point is that Germany is increasing strongly its renewables part in the mix, which you see very clearly in the power mix trend here. The bad point is that so far it does not have a direct impact on the CO2 emissions, and the CO2 emissions in Germany remain very high and have not been decreasing a lot in the past years and are not decreasing right now because basically the renewables take a strong part, but basically are replacing nuclear and a little more than nuclear. But so the energy mix is not decarbonizing at a very high speed, and coal plus gas still represent a very big part of the energy mix in Germany, even if during the last year 2017, coal decreased a little bit more by -5%. But as you can see in the power mix trend here on the right, the fossil fuel part is still very high in Germany. So one good trend in renewables development, which is very well known, but at the same time, the energy mix remains very carbon intensive. Yeah, there is one larger question about the EU and focus on France, Germany, UK. So do you expect some regulatory decisions to impact each power mix trend or political decisions to be made? So tricky point, the European Union is regularly monitoring the results, discussing new objectives, and currently discussing the new package in order to increase the objectives about energy efficiency and about renewables development. So there are strong discussions on this side. The thing is that the EU is committing as one unit when we talk about COP 21, 22, etc. So, and then there is the objectives are not mandatory per country, and there are no laws at the European level that ensure that all the countries are committed with penalties in case of not reaching the objective. So that's a tricky point. So at the same time, the EU has shown good results in the past years in terms of energy efficiency, but the energy mix has not changed a lot. And so now the European Union is on one hand willing to increase its commitment and make sure it shows a good example at the world level, and at the same time the results this year are disappointing. So this is a big challenge. That's why we wanted to show it. We could do it with Spain, with Italy, with very different countries. We wanted to show the French example here, which is different from Germany. France is not CO2 emissions intensive because thanks to the nuclear part in the power mix, and France had enjoyed some good trends in emissions reduction, also to be compared with the economic growth, which was quite limited in France the previous 10 years. Now the emissions grew, which comes both from a recovery in the energy, in the economic growth, but also from a temporary change in the energy mix, because these have been 2 bad years in terms of nuclear production, and last year in terms of hydroelectricity, like mentioned. So probably the power mix would be coming back soon with less gas. But nevertheless, the energy mix as a whole is not changing a lot if you look to the primary mix. So the challenge in France about energy intensity decrease, about renewables development remains the same. And today is quite far from the French announced objectives. And at the same time that there are these difficulties, France is discussing today a new law and new objectives to be more ambitious for the future. That's interesting. And the UK, which we do not, we quite often talk about Germany and France and compare these countries and so on. So it was interesting to us to mention UK, which we work with on a regular basis, and the trends are very interesting. So the economy is less energy intensive and is changing to more services, so they benefit from this, but also from strong efforts in energy efficiency for years and years, and also from the renewables development on one hand, and on the second hand, the decision to phase out from coal, which is, you can see very clearly over there. So there are trends. The answer to the question whether there will be regulatory decisions on this at the European level is, well, we couldn't guess this. Just the EU ETS reform that has been recently discussed long months and so on, and came to decisions. We put out a research program at the end of last year on this, just showing that it's good technically speaking, but it's not enough, and it will not change the overall trends.
Hello, Morgan Krenes speaking. A few questions about projection for energy mix. So as you may know, we have a dedicated service at Enerdata called Future, where we run a model and we have some projection. We have 3 scenarios we update every year. A scenario in line with NDC objective, and another one, Green, which is in line with the 2 degrees limitation of temperature increase. And a couple of days ago, we launched a new service which is called Outlook, and you can have access freely to this service, and you will have some projections available directly on our website for the primary energy mix, final consumptions, consumption per region, etc. So you can have a look at it, and it might answer some of your questions. Then, if you want,
and we'll send the link with the
documentation. Yeah, of course, we'll send the link of the service with the documentation and the presentation. But if you want to have a more closely look at some projection for some countries and some sectors, some fuel, you can try Future. So there is also some questions about the analysis per sector. So in this presentation, we only mention our analysis at the global CO2 emission level, global consumption, and then we had some focuses on countries and energies. But the analysis per sector, we didn't do it in this presentation, but we do have the data. So if you have specific question regarding this, we could answer to these questions later on by email. So do not hesitate to contact us for all these questions about trends per sectors. Looking at the last questions we received. There were a few questions about power technologies. So again, we have a dedicated service called a Power Plant Tracker, where we track all the new power plants built around the world per technologies, and with additional information about capex, efficiency. So you can also get information from this service. Few questions about China. What will replace coal in the mix? So it will not be only one source of energy replacing coal. It will be a mix of all available energy, including nuclear, but also, of course, renewable solar, wind. It will not be only one technology replacing coal. That's for sure.
So there is a lot of questions coming at the last moment, so that's a bit tricky. What we will do anyway is that we will sending you the documents, the PowerPoint or PDF document. We will send you the link to the website also with the forecast that Morgan mentioned, and we'll send a document also with the questions and answer so that it's shared. Which was we just said and what we did not say, and then we'll come back to the different people that ask all the questions. Otherwise, we could last a little more. Okay, so if I may conclude, do you have? Well, we'll go. We'll put the answers on the document. That would be clearer. So if I may conclude, I would like to thank you all for your participation. Don't hesitate to come back to us for any question where we might help giving you figure or analysis or thoughts on the evolution. So thank you again, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.